I will do a second round, and I guess I'd like to first start by asking the witnesses who are here present in the room whether any of you endorse the proposition that there is nothing going on here that is out of the ordinary for climate-related risk. No, 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 no? Okay. Do any of you doubt that unusual risk is being caused by emissions from fossil fuel combustion? No, 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 no. Everybody accepts that that correlation exists. Okay. Thanks. Ms. Curry, I've got a few questions for you, if you don't mind. First, do you recall how many times you've testified before Congress on the subject of climate change?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of the question.
Do you recall how many times you've testified before Congress on the subject of climate change?
This would be my 13th time.
Thank you. And on those occasions, has your message essentially been that there's a lot of uncertainty, we don't really know what's driving observed warming, the models are unreliable, and the IPCC models are not to be trusted?
No, that's not what I would summarize my statements as. There's,
all right. Well, let's revisit one of the previous times that you testified before Congress in 2014 before the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, and I was your interlocutor then. I don't know if you recall that among your 13 episodes of testimony. But let me prompt you. In your written testimony for that hearing, you wrote that several key elements of the IPCC's fifth assessment report point to, your language here, a weakening of the case for attributing most of the warming to human influences relative to the previous assessment. And to support that, you listed the following assertions. The first was a lack of warming since 1998, and growing discrepancies between observations and climate model projections. The second was sea level rise from 1920 to 1950 being of the same magnitude as 1993 to 2012. And the third was increasing Antarctic sea ice. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Okay, let's look at those assertions and see how they've aged. And let's start with the alleged lack of warming since 1998. Let me propose first that 1998 was an exceptionally strong El Nino year, so picking it as a start or end date for a period builds in an anomaly. Is that correct?
Yes. Do you want me to explain my perspective on the
I'll give you time at the end, but I'd like to get through my questions to you first, if I may. So is it true that the last years, 2015 to 2022, have been the 8 warmest years on record? Is that true?
Yes.
That is
Yes.
true. So is it still your testimony that there actually is a lack of warming?
There is, if you read the fine print in my 2014 testimony, my main point was that there was a great deal of natural internal variability that influences decadal scale variability.
It was you who used the phrase lack of warming, and I'm asking if you would still describe what's going on as a lack of warming.
No, we've seen a big super mega El Nino in 2016, which remains the high point. And since 2016, we haven't seen any
lack of warming
further increases beyond 2016.
So let's go to your next point about modeling discrepancies, that there were growing discrepancies between observations and climate model predictions. I'd like to show you a review that was done of models that were run by the IPCC back in 2004. And for those of you who are not familiar with the graph, the blue part defines the range of the different models that were run for the IPCC. And the black line that runs through the middle of that range is the mean of those models. And the red goes back and is actually observed temperature information. So the first two, the blue and the black, are the prediction range and the prediction mean, and the red is what actually happened. And it strikes me that it looks like it's tracked pretty well. So let me ask you, Dr. Curry, is it still your testimony that climate modeling has not proven accurate?
Okay, this is the diagram you're showing is a flawed analysis. Let's pay attention to what the most recent IPCC assessment report has to say. They found a number of global climate models running too hot. In fact, they even changed their way of making projections for the 21st century that relies less on climate models. They no
Dr.
longer
Curry,
use
doesn't the blue
models.
range imply that there were some models that ran too hot, but also others that ran too cold, and that's why there's a range?
Yeah, on average,
Got
on
it. Thank you.
average.
And then the average is the mean, which is the black line, which tracks extremely well with the
That
red
particular
data.
graph
Correct?
that you have is a flawed analysis.
Okay. Well,
Let's
let me
pay
go on.
attention
You
to
disagree
what
with the
the
analysis, I get it.
IPCC's sixth assessment report
You
has to
talk
say.
also that there's been no increase in sea level rise rate. According to the IPCC, sea level rise has more than doubled from the 1901 to 1990 period to the 1993 to 2015 period, and that since 2015, it has accelerated further beyond the doubling. Do you dispute those determinations?
The point I made in my 2014 testimony is that there is a great deal of multi-decadal variability in sea level rise, which we saw a sharp increase in the first half of the 20th century. I'm not saying that sea level rise isn't increasing. I'm
Okay.
not saying that
Are you
global
saying that this
warming
rate of sea level rise is not increasing? Or do you concede that both sea level rise is increasing and the rate of sea level rise is also increasing?
It depends on the time scale you look at and the causes that you attribute to it. It's, yes, yes, there has been.
The history of the Industrial Revolution, the period in which emissions have begun to have an effect.
Okay.
I'm not talking about
sea level,
paleo history.
okay, sea level rise, the modern sea level rise started increasing in about the mid-19th century. This is coming out of the Little Ice Age, and at that point had little to do with fossil fueled warming. So
Is that
there
still
are a
the case
lot of
today, or does it
factors.
now have to do with fossil fuel warming?
Fossil fuel warming is certainly contributing to the slow creep of sea level rise. I've never questioned that.
Okay, and you say it's a slow creep, but it's also an accelerating upward rise, is it not?
The how to infer acceleration in sea level rise is disputed among experts.
Okay. You've
It's a
accused
very
the
slow
IPCC
acceleration.
You've accused the IPCC of corruption. Do you stand by that term?
The IPCC is a highly politicized organization. The recent synthesis and assessment report for the sixth assessment that was just released this week, I mean, that is a very highly politicized.
Do you stand by your use of the term corruption regarding the IPCC?
It has to be qualified. It's a highly politicized organization.
How about the IPCC's definition of anthropogenic climate change being a hoax? Do you stand by that term?
I've never used those words.
Okay. Let me take you into the I'm actually reading off a blog with these definitions in mind. Here are two examples that qualify as hoaxes that I've previously written about the UNFCCC definition of climate change arguably qualifies as a hoax. So I refer you to that, and with unanimous consent, we'll make that a part of the record. If we don't mind, let's go to Exxon.
Would you like me to clarify that statement?
I think
I
it
would
needs a
like
lot
to
of clarification,
clarify that
indeed.
statement.
And I'll let you
Okay.
clarify it for the record. Okay?
Okay.
You'll have all the
You
time in the world to write whatever you want and add that as a in a response to the record.
No, I
So
would
let's
like
look
to
for a
re-
moment at other models. If the IPCC is potentially corrupt and if its definition is a hoax, Exxon.
The IPCC, can I clarify before we go much further? The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change now defines climate change to be only human-caused climate change. Their definition does not include natural climate variability. And this flies in the face of all the understanding of geology and atmospheric science and all the other scientific fields. It's a political definition that the
Fair enough.
UNFCCC
And if you want to
has
expand on that,
provided.
you're welcome to do so in your response for the record. But let me take my time here and show you the graph that Exxon scientists developed to model climate change, both CO2 concentration and observed temperature change. And for those of you not familiar with the graph, the original black lines are the ones that are developed by the Exxon scientists. The blue line is the actual measurements, and the red line is the actual measurements, the blue being CO2 concentration and the red being observed temperature. Do you concede that Exxon's models prove to be pretty accurate, just like the IPCC models?
No, that model is a toy model that Exxon used. And I don't think it's a useful contribution to the dialogue.
In 1968, the American Petroleum Institute commissioned a report on climate change from scientists at Stanford. And those scientists concluded, I'll read from the report language here, significant temperature changes are almost certain to occur by the year 2000, and these could bring about climate change. If the Earth's temperature increases significantly, a number of events might be expected to occur, including the melting of the Antarctic ice cap, a rise in sea levels, warming of the oceans. It is clear that we are unsure as to what our long-lived pollutants are doing to our environment. However, there seems to be no doubt that the potential damage to our environment could be severe. Do you doubt the scientists hired by the American Petroleum Institute or their statement?
Our knowledge of climate change was in its infancy in the 1960s. The first assessment report by the IPCC, published in 1990 or 1991, found that there was no evidence of human-caused warming beyond natural climate variability at the time of the early 1990s. And that
So
was
the API scientists got it wrong too when they presented that conclusion.
no, they had a weakly justified argument and a weak knowledge base at the time.
And events have proven them wrong in some
It's not
fashion, do you
something
believe?
that's useful. So it's not something that's useful
Okay.
to consider at this point.
So the other thing you cited was increasing Antarctic sea ice. And the last 8 years have seen below average summer minimum ice for the Antarctic, with this year being a record low. Do you still stand by the proposition that Antarctic sea ice is increasing?
There's a great deal of interannual and decadal scale variability. The IPCC does not make any assessment that human-caused warming is contributing with confidence to a change in the Antarctic sea ice beyond natural climate variability.
But you think that the Antarctic sea ice was increasing, just as a measurement. Is that still correct?
There's, like I said, there's a great deal of year-to-year and decadal variability in the Antarctic sea ice which was what I was commenting on.
Okay. Let me refer you back to an article that you wrote in the Washington Post in 2007, and I'll read your words then. If the risk is great, then it may be worth acting against, even if its probability is small. Think of risk as the product of consequences and likelihood, what can happen and the odds of it happening. A 10-degree rise in global temperatures by 2100 is not likely. The panel gives it a 3% probability. Such low probability, high impact risks are routinely factored into analysis and management strategy. And I'll interrupt your quote to say probably by the kind of folks who are here sitting in the room with me today, the experts and the executives of major risk-bearing enterprises. Whether on Wall Street or at the Pentagon, you continue. The rationale for reducing emissions of carbon dioxide is to reduce the risk of the possibility of catastrophic outcomes. Making the transition to cleaner fuels has the added benefit of reducing the impact on public health and ecosystems and improving energy security, providing benefits even if the risk is eventually reduced. I've yet to see any option that is worse than ignoring the risk of global warming and doing nothing. Has your view changed since that 2007 article?
My notions of risk were naive circa 2007. In the intervening time, I have educated myself very substantially in risk sciences, and I have a book in press entitled Climate Uncertainty and Risks that has been extensively reviewed, peer-reviewed by an academic press. And that book outlines my current understanding of how we should think about climate risk. Some of my understanding I was able to include in my written testimony submitted to this committee.
In 2014, I asked you if you thought there was real risk from climate change and if should we figure out how to deal with it, and you replied, we may decide to do nothing and see what happens. Do you still recommend that strategy?
I didn't recommend that strategy. I said that is an option.
Do you still consider it to be a realistic or plausible or prudent option?
I think we should actively work to adapt to extreme weather events and sea level rise. I think we need new energy infrastructure for the 21st century with more abundant, cleaner, more reliable energy.
And in your testimony here today, you suggest that one of the things that can save us from climate change and reduce the risk is volcano eruptions. Is that correct?
No, I'm saying that climate models do not include the simulations for the 21st century do not include scenarios of extreme explosive volcanic eruptions, such as occurred in the early 19th century. If those were to occur, we could see a 0.5 degree centigrade cooling over several decades. The point of that is to emphasize that natural climate variability can be very substantial, and this isn't properly taking into account in our considerations of how the climate might play out in the 21st century. That's the point that I'm making.
Let me close out with a question for the witnesses who are here in the room, and that is to offer your view on the diligence, integrity, and reliability of the modeling that you count on in doing your planning and projections. Starting, I guess, with Mr. Anderson, we'll go across the four of you and conclude the hearing.
That's a great question. I would say one of the special things about the models that the insurance industry uses is that it actually, money changes hands over the interpretation of those models. So the confidence around them and the need for those models to be as up to date and insightful is critical to
Powerful incentive to get it right.
So I think it's as I think Mr. Teodoro said, it is something that we are continuing to work on as new information becomes available because it moves markets. And so it's critical that we continue to improve it.
Ms. Watkins?
The risks that we're modeling are complicated, and so the models need to be complicated to be useful. They don't agree. They do evolve. The question is, can they be used safely and appropriately? And that does require expertise. I think that upping the level of expertise in terms of risk-aware, climate-aware planning is going to help an awful lot in demystifying these models.
But you count on the models, and they're valuable to use in doing the planning and the work that you do.
They're definitely the state of the art for actuaries in getting the risk accurately priced and evaluated, and that's what we do.
And one of the reasons that this is a difficult enterprise is because things are in fact changing. Is that not the problem?
That's right.
Yeah.
But we are trying to use the models to evaluate what the changes are and what that means for the potential outcomes.
Dr. Keyes?
Thank you for the question, Senator. The data that we use as researchers often comes from the government, and we're especially thankful for the scientists at NOAA and elsewhere who make their data available and make regular improvements to their data. So they're doing outstanding work. I think there is room for improvement in terms of sharing data between the private sector and the public sector and understanding what the differences or discrepancies might be between the different models. I think there's also a role for the democratization of this data to make it more accessible to households so that they can better understand the risks they face. I think one of the asymmetries is that the insurance markets often know a lot more about the risks than the households or the businesses do.
Mr. Theodoro, reliability of models?
Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse, for the question. The modeling industry has really advanced by leaps and bounds since it was essentially born in 1992 in the wake of Hurricane Andrew. And since that time, there have been three main models that are used and licensed by risk practitioners. Typically, large insurers and reinsurers use all three, and they may have their own proprietary. There's a fourth model, which has now entered the fray.
And Mr. Anderson is correct that a lot of money rides on getting it right, in addition to potential fiduciary liability if you really blow it, correct?
Yeah, licensing the models is not an inexpensive proposition. So as I said earlier, they're not capable of getting a point estimate, exactly how much loss are we going to have at this particular time, but directionally is what we look at to give the headlights into where we're going.
Love hearing you use the word headlights. That's my phrase. I say science is the headlights that drives us forward and lets us see what's coming. And with that, let me call the hearing to an end.